Welcome back, everyone. Ready for another deep dive?
Always ready to dive in.
Okay, great. Today, we're going deep on Trumpism. Seems like it's everywhere these days, right?
It's definitely been one of the most talked about political phenomena in recent times.
And to unpack it all, looks like you've given us a pretty interesting mix of sources to work with.
Absolutely. Pulling from different angles is essential for this one.
I can already tell this is going to be a fascinating deep dive.
It is. And jumping right in, one of the first things that stood out from the sources was this comparison to something called Jacksonian democracy.
Jacksonian democracy.
Yeah, it's a movement from the 1800s during Andrew Jackson's presidency. And believe it or not, the sources actually drew parallels between Trump rallies and the political climate back then.
Wow, that's going way back.
Yeah.
So we're talking fiery rallies and populist anger, even back in the 1800s.
Exactly. The sources highlight how Jackson tapped into public anger against the elites, just like Trump did. It's fascinating to see how certain patterns repeat throughout history.
Okay, so are we saying Trumpism is basically Jacksonian democracy 2.0?
Well, not so fast. While historical echoes are important, we can't just slap a label on it like that. It's crucial to understand those historical parallels, but also the key differences.
Makes sense. Got to look at the nuances.
Yeah.
So what sets them apart? What makes Trumpism unique to our time?
That's the million-dollar question. While Jackson, for all his flaws, championed this vision of expanding democratic participation.
Okay, expanding democratic participation.
Right, though it was often limited by the prejudices of his time, which is a whole other conversation. But the core idea is essential, and it's where we start to see how Trumpism diverges.
Gotcha. So it's not just a simple repeat of history. We're talking about a new beast entirely, shaped by the unique context of the 21st century. And speaking of historical context, I noticed the sources mention the America First Committee quite a bit, too, especially its ties to isolationism and anti-globalization.
And rightfully so. The America First Committee was incredibly influential in the lead up to World War II, advocating for, well, America First meaning staying out of foreign entanglements, focusing inward.
Sounds familiar, right? That whole America First rhetoric definitely echoes in Trumpism. It's like these themes keep coming back around.
I do, and that's what makes this exploration so fascinating. The sources even touch on McCarthyism, with its witch hunts and fear-mongering.
Wow, McCarthyism too. Okay, so we've got Jacksonian democracy, America First, McCarthyism. It's like we're tracing these recurring themes throughout American history. Makes you wonder, though, what makes these ideas resonate at different points in time?
Exactly. It begs the question, what societal conditions, what anxieties make these ideas resurface again and again? That's what we need to unpack to really understand Trumpism.
It's like these ideas strike a chord deep within the American psyche, something about identity, belonging, even fear, that resonates across generations.
You hit the nail on the head. And it's interesting, because the Wikipedia entry on Trumpism, it doesn't even try to define it by specific policies. It focuses much more on the feeling, the sentiment it evokes.
That's true. I noticed that too. It's less about the specifics and more about the overall feeling.
Exactly. And that actually speaks to a fundamental aspect of Trumpism that many researchers highlight. It's driven more by identity and emotion than by traditional political ideology.
Identity and emotion over traditional politics. Interesting. Now that you mention it, it does make you think about those Trump rallies. The energy, the passion. It often felt less about policy details and more about, well, a feeling, a shared sense of grievance, maybe.
Precisely. And the sources link this to a concept called effective politics. It's a mouthful, I know.
Effective politics. Okay, break that down for me. What is that exactly?
Essentially, it's all about appealing to people's emotions, their hopes, their fears, their anxieties over their rational minds.
So less about facts and figures, more about tapping into that gut feeling. But isn't that kind of dangerous? I mean, we've seen throughout history how easily emotions can be manipulated.
It absolutely can be dangerous, especially when those emotions are harnessed for political gain.
Right, and often by pointing them towards a specific target or group to blame for their problems.
Exactly. It's about understanding the emotional landscape where Trumpism emerged from, the specific anxieties that made it so appealing to certain groups.
And the sources kept mentioning this idea of a deep story. What exactly is that?
It's fascinating. The book Strangers in Their Own Land really delves into this concept. Essentially, it argues that many Trump supporters felt like their values, their very way of life, were being ignored or even mocked by those they perceived as elites.
So they felt like strangers in their own country, like their voices weren't being heard by the people in power.
Precisely. And that's where Trump came in. Whether intentionally or not, he connected with these voters on a visceral level, speaking directly to their anxieties, validating their deep story, and offering himself as the solution.
He became the voice for the voiceless, at least in their eyes.
Exactly. And this is where it gets even more interesting, because to understand how he achieved that connection, we have to look at the media, not just any media, though, social media.
Here's where it gets really interesting. Because the sources highlight how Trump leveraged media, especially social media, in ways we'd never seen before in a political leader. He could bypass traditional gatekeepers, speak directly to millions.
And control the narrative. For the first time in history, a politician could instantaneously share their message unfiltered with a global audience.
It was unprecedented.
And incredibly powerful, as we saw. The sources even go as far as to refer to Trump as a product of American media.
Wow, a product of American media. That's a bold statement.
It is, and it's not just some fringe theory either. We see voices from both sides of the political spectrum acknowledging this dynamic.
It's true. I've heard that sentiment echoed by both liberals and conservatives. There's that quote from this CBS executive still sends chills down my spine saying, "It may not be good for America, but it's damn good for CBS."
It's a chilling statement.
Basically admitting that controversy equals profit, even if it comes at the expense of truth or national unity.
And that's the danger of this profit-driven media landscape, isn't it? The more outrageous the rhetoric, the more clicks and views it generates. Truth and nuance become secondary.
It's a vicious cycle.
It really is. And it makes you wonder about the future of news, the future of our democracy, when this is the game that's being played.
It's a scary thought.
It is, and it makes it all the more important to be critical consumers of information, especially in this age of social media.
Right. Don't just believe everything you read online.
Exactly. Fact check, seek out diverse perspectives, and be wary of anyone claiming to have all the answers.
Words to live by. But yet there's another layer to this whole Trumpism phenomenon that we haven't even touched on yet. Masculinity.
Ah, yes. Masculinity, a complex and often overlooked aspect of this whole discussion.
And not just any masculinity, right? The sources use these terms like toxic masculinity and hegemonic masculinity to describe what they see at play here.
Exactly. And it gets to the heart of how gender roles, and particularly these traditional notions of masculinity, might have played a role in Trump's appeal.
It's true. The sources spend a lot of time on that. It's almost like they're saying that Trump, whether intentionally or not, tapped into these deeply ingrained ideas about what it means to be a man in America.
And a certain type of man at that. Someone who embodies strength, dominance, power.
The alpha male.
Exactly. The sources even quote a scholar who refers to Trump as an uber male, this almost fantasy figure representing this unrestrained masculinity that some men seem to crave.
It's an interesting take, and it makes you wonder what anxieties these men might have been facing. Were they economic anxieties, social anxieties?
Perhaps even anxieties about their own masculinity in a rapidly changing world?
It's a lot to unpack.
Yeah.
But this connection between Trumpism and masculinity, it adds another layer of complexity to understanding this political phenomenon.
It does, and it raises questions about how these anxieties, these deeply ingrained social norms, might have created the perfect breeding ground for Trumpism to flourish.
It's fascinating.
Yeah.
And honestly, a little bit scary to think about.
I agree. But knowledge is power, right? And the more we understand the forces at play here, the better equipped we are to navigate these complex times.
That's for sure.
It's true, this isn't just an American story anymore. The sources point to figures like Bolsonaro in Brazil, Duterte in the Philippines, Orban in Hungary, all embodying this shift towards strongman politics. It's a global trend that's impossible to ignore.
It's like this wave of populism sweeping across continents, each leader tapping into the unique anxieties of their own nations. And what's even more unsettling is how many of them have started chipping away at democratic institutions, consolidating power in their own hands.
That's the danger we have to be incredibly wary of when you have leaders who openly attack the media, the judiciary, any institution meant to hold them accountable. It weakens the very foundation of a democratic society, and it often starts subtly, almost imperceptibly, until those checks and balances are so eroded it's too late.
That's a chilling thought.
Yeah.
It makes you wonder, are these leaders just capitalizing on existing societal trends, or are they actively pushing us towards a more authoritarian future?
It's a question that keeps historians and political scientists up at night. It's probably a mix of both, wouldn't you say? Societal trends create the conditions, the fertile ground for these leaders to take root. But once in power, their actions can further inflame those anxieties, exacerbate divisions, and push society down a dangerous path.
And it makes this whole analysis of Trumpism feel even more urgent because if we can understand what fueled its rise here, maybe, just maybe, we can recognize the warning signs and prevent it from happening elsewhere, or at least mitigate the damage.
Knowledge is power, absolutely. The more we understand the complex interplay of historical forces, emotional appeals, and media manipulation that led to something like Trumpism, the better equipped we are to protect democratic values and institutions in the future.
It's almost like we're in this constant game of catch-up, trying to understand and respond to these new forms of political movements. And one thing we haven't talked about yet is how Trump himself communicated his style. Because it wasn't just what he said, but how he said it that resonated with people. Right?
You're hitting on something incredibly important. The sources draw fascinating parallels between Trump's communication style and that of a stand-up comedian. It's a comparison that might seem outlandish at first, but when you really think about it, there are some striking similarities.
Now that you mention it, I remember those Trump rallies, the energy, the call and response, the way he played the crowd. It was like a performance, a show.
Exactly, and that's a key insight here. Trump, whether consciously or not, employed techniques common in stand-up comedy, using humor, repetition, even exaggeration, to connect with his audience on an emotional level. He understood the power of storytelling, of crafting a narrative that resonated with their anxieties and aspirations.
And it wasn't just about making people laugh, right? It was about making them feel seen, heard, understood, even if the message itself was simplistic, divisive, or just plain inaccurate.
Absolutely. It's about creating that sense of belonging, of shared identity that's so powerful in politics. When people feel like they're part of something larger than themselves, part of a movement, they're more likely to overlook inconsistencies, even outright falsehoods in the message.
It's almost like he created this alternate reality, this bubble where facts didn't matter as much as the feeling, the emotional connections in social media only amplify that effect, creating these echo chambers where dissenting voices were drowned out.
Precisely. It's a potent combination, and one we need to be acutely aware of because, as we've seen, this playbook doesn't just disappear after one election cycle. It's being studied, adapted, and refined by political movements around the globe.
So what do we do with all this? I mean, we've uncovered some pretty disturbing trends here. The rise of strongman politics, the erosion of democratic norms, the manipulation of media and emotion. It's a lot to process.
It is a lot, and it's easy to feel overwhelmed. But I think the most important takeaway is this: stay informed, stay engaged, and never stop questioning.
Those are words to live by, really. But what does that look like in practice? How do we as individuals push back against these forces?
We need to be critical consumers of information, especially in this age of social media. Don't just accept things at face value, fact check. Seek out diverse perspectives and be wary of anyone claiming to have all the answers.
It's about being active participants in our democracy, not passive bystanders.
Exactly. And that means engaging in thoughtful dialogue, even with those we disagree with. It means holding our elected officials accountable, demanding transparency and integrity. It means supporting organizations that are fighting to protect democratic values and institutions.
And it all starts with understanding the forces at play, recognizing the patterns so we're not doomed to repeat them.
You got it. Knowledge is the first line of defense against these threats to democracy.
So where do we go from here? We've covered a lot of ground in this deep dive: historical parallels, psychological factors, media manipulation, even the global implications of Trumpism. But I still feel like we've only scratched the surface.
And you're right. This is just the beginning of a much larger conversation.
A conversation we all need to be a part of. But before we get too carried away, I think it's time for our provocative closing thought something to leave our listeners pondering. What do you have for us today?
Given all we've discussed about the power of storytelling in shaping political realities, the question I'll leave you with is this: whose stories are being told and whose stories are being silenced? And what does that tell us about the state of our democracy?
Wow, that's a powerful question to consider. Whose stories are we hearing? And whose are being drowned out in all this noise? It makes you think about the very foundations of democracy and whether it's truly representative if certain groups are being systematically excluded or ignored.
It's a crucial point, and one that often gets lost in the daily barrage of headlines and political maneuvering. We have to constantly ask ourselves, who benefits from the stories being told and who is marginalized or silenced in the process? Because those silences, those untold stories, can be incredibly revealing.
It's like that saying, history is written by the victors. But what if we could amplify those other voices, the ones who have been historically marginalized or excluded? How might that change our understanding of not just Trumpism, but of America itself?
It's an essential question, and one that scholars and activists are grappling with right now, because by unearthing those untold stories, by understanding the experiences and perspectives of those who have been systematically excluded, we gain a much richer, more nuanced understanding of our past and present.
And that, I think, is what this deep dive has been all about. Getting beyond the surface-level narratives, challenging our own assumptions, and digging deeper into the complex forces that have shaped our world.
It's been quite a journey, hasn't it? We've explored the historical echoes of Trumpism, delved into the psychology behind its appeal, grappled with the media's role in amplifying its message, and even confronted some uncomfortable truths about gender and identity.
And we've done all of that through the lens of these sources you provided, which is a testament to the power of research and critical thinking. Because let's face it, there's no shortage of information out there.
Yeah.
But it's the ability to sift through it, to identify the biases, to connect the dots. That's what allows us to make sense of this complex world.
Absolutely. We've barely scratched the surface, but hopefully this deep dive has given you the tools and the inspiration to keep asking questions, keep seeking out diverse perspectives, and keep engaging in this messy, essential work of understanding our world and our place in it.
Couldn't have said it better myself. Remember, folks, knowledge is power. And the more we know, the better equipped we are to build a more just and equitable future. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive, and keep those curious minds buzzing.
For more mind-expanding content,
Subscribe to the Daniel David Allen YouTube channel, where RoboCast is posted every weekday.
until next time,
Stay curious.
keep exploring.